Why do you believe that the Gospels were written for Christians? It's a very interesting idea. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, we assume that the Gospels were written for Christians because they would be the ones interested in hearing the story. You know, Christendom is 2,000 years old now, and so the Jesus story has been talked about uh, for about, 1,990 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit old hat to most Christians. If you attend church with any regularity, if you've read the Gospels a few times, you know the details pretty well. But for the very first generation, they didn't all know the details. Jesus's followers knew these things real well. His disciples, of course, knew them very well. But if you lived in Greece or you lived in Italy or North Africa, what do you know? And you hear one or two stories about Jesus. You hear about the words of institution at the Last Supper. You hear about his death, his resurrection. You hear that he's healed people. You've heard something about him being a great teacher, but you don't know the story. And so it was important for these Gospels to be written and circulated, and that's what happened. And that's how people began to know the story of Jesus better. It was because of these Gospels. That's why they had to be written down. And of course, they had to be copied again and again and again. And so they were spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond.
Mm. So it's interesting. In the book, you talk a little bit about the people requesting Mark specifically, according to tradition, to write down the sayings of Peter and stuff. So can you talk a little bit about what that is and kind of how it might play into the gospel being written for Christians?
Yeah, exactly. People were eager. Jesus's teaching was compelling. People wanted to hear it. And it's one thing to hear, word of mouth. And that is the primary way of teaching back in antiquity. And some teacher would speak and his disciples would listen and they'd hear him talk again and again and again, and then they'd go out and speak. But it was better if the teachers themselves, the apostolic teachers and their right-hand aides and assistants, if they'd committed to writing, and then you could disseminate it further and you'd have something a little more stable. It was less likely for the teaching to evolve into forms and emphases that were not authentic and were not really original to what Jesus was talking about. Jesus gave his disciples plenty of latitude. He wanted them to take his teaching and apply it. He says so in Matthew 13. That's the way pedagogy, in fact, was done in antiquity, and not everybody understands that. And so they see a discrepancy where Jesus's words are paraphrased a little bit, and they think, oh, that's a mistake or there's something wrong. Well, no, that's how Jesus taught his disciples. That's how I teach my students. I don't want them simply to repeat my words verbatim. I want to make sure they understand what I'm talking about, and they can put my teachings, my thoughts into their words. That's what Jesus did. And so there is some interpretive paraphrase in the Gospels, and that's just fine. And so that's why Christians know not only what Jesus originally said when he spoke in Aramaic in the year 29 in Israel, but they can hear him now speak in Greek, paraphrased a little bit, so they understand better given the time and place they live in. That's the beauty of the Gospels. That's why there are 4 of them and not just one.